It's an insightful panel discussion which is titled Continental Drift, Navigating the Trade Waves. This discussion will delve into the complexities of global trade dynamics and the impact of shifting geopolitical landscapes on international commerce.
Absolutely, but before that you want to remind our guests that there is a big contest on as well?
Exactly, the Social Champ contest is on. I know you've heard me say this quite some more time, but I'll say it once more. The QR code, you need to go to Jahangir, scan the QR code and visit the site and share your information about what the session's been like for you. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Indeed.
All right, so let's move on.
Absolutely. In fact, our next panelists, they will be shedding light on the challenges as well as the opportunities which have been presented by the Continental Drift, much like this drift which is coming in the audio. But also it is going to be offering invaluable insights into how businesses and policymakers can adapt and thrive in this ever-changing landscape. So first up, we'd like to invite on stage our moderator, Ajay Sharma, the senior editor at ET Glad to have you here, Ajay.
And joining him are his panelists. We have Roberto Azvedo, the former Director General at the World Trade Organization, along with Robert Johnson, President, Institute for New Economic Thinking.
I'm sure we can muster up some more enthusiasm for that. This is a big old panel coming up your way. Over to you, Ajay.
Thanks, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much once again. This is a panel joined by Roberto and Robert Johnson. We will be focusing on international trade and the factors which would be influencing, how to become a large player in international trade. India has got massive ambitions, as you all know. But, the world is a very disrupted place right now. Historically, India as a country has not had a big footprint on international trade. Largely, we have been importers of commodities and beyond technology of pharma. We have been a smaller player in global trade, but we aim to become, and our share of global trade is on a rise. But before we go, and how should the policy making should be shaped to achieve our ambitions out there, I'll ask you to start, Roberto, from the vantage point of you've been with the World Trade Organization. You've seen models, economic models of various large countries which have very much larger share of global GDP, global trade. What is the backdrop we are operating in? There is geopolitics, a disruption from climate change, AI will come on that one too. Can you lay down the context for this discussion and the backdrop we are operating in right now?
Yeah, well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I would say what we don't lack today is disruption, right? You have disruption of all nature, all sorts, everywhere. But there are some main, very key aspects of disruption that I think we have to bear in mind. And they are provoking a number of movements in terms of public policy in different countries. And those movements are not coordinated, they're fragmented, and they're often at odds with each other. So I would say geopolitics. So people are talking about disruption in supply chains. The disruption in supply chains began long before the pandemic. You all recall the tensions between the US and China during the Trump administration and subsequently, when we had essentially people call it a trade war, which I can see why they would call that, with duties, extra duties on imports of aluminum, steel, and a number of other products. It started with China, but other countries were affected as well. Then you had the Russia-Ukraine crisis as well. Well, the Middle East now is not for amateurs, so the reality is that countries are either imposing or being subject to sanctions. And companies are obviously affected by that. And the reality is that it's completely unpredictable, not only the amount of the sanctions, the size of the sanctions, but also where they're going to pop up and how you're going to be affected. On top of that, you have other pandemics, climate disasters or natural disasters, and you have now public opinion and consumer preference, which is shaping public policy as well. And there are the most traditional ones, like health concerns, like the content of sugar, salt, organic products, agriculture, etc. You see Europe is now in upheaval because of all that. But one major destructuring element is climate and environment. So you had the oil shock back in the 70s that was very disruptive. Then you had the digital revolution at the beginning of the 21st century. And now you have, I would say, the environment and climate disruption. Because we have all these commitments that we're undertaking at the UN framework, and those commitments require policies to incentivize or discourage companies from moving in one direction or another. And countries are acting. The US passed the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that has very little about inflation and a lot about environment and climate. Europe is with CBAM right now, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And those things, they either give advantages to companies or take advantage away from them. And those things upset the balance of competition in companies across the border. And I have to say, these measures are going to be introduced and are being introduced with no coordination whatsoever, responding mostly to domestic pressure. And the reality is that this is coming at a time when we don't have a body to have this kind of conversation. The multilateral institutions are weak. The World Trade Organization is unable to handle these kind of things. And when their rules were negotiated, these conversations didn't even exist.
Right.
And together with all this, a lot of protectionism.
I was coming to that. We should not forget there are 70 elections in the world this year or the next 12 to 15 months. And politics will also influence a lot of policy making. Countries will tilt toward protectionism, and however much each of the countries may want to become independent, everybody knows, we understand that the world is dependent on each other. How can a quick follow-up with you, Roberto? How can, in this environment, when there are kind of equations between, say, U.S., China, Middle East is emerging in a great fashion. Russia has its stance, and India is caught between. How can a balance be struck in this kind of a scenario where we don't, or any country doesn't give out or be a loser in their own agenda as well, but still be a favorable international trade partner? Can we strike a balance?
The reality is that the lack of forum doesn't mean that talks are not happening. That's the problem. So we were talking about climate measures, right? Policies that were being introduced. Some are already talking about a carbon club. So countries, say the US, the EU, maybe Japan, Australia, and others, are talking to each other to achieve some kind of understanding on how they're going to allow their products to cross the borders, right? Maybe through mutual recognition agreements or something like that. But it's a very tough conversation. How are you going to have that conversation when the interests are very different, right? And India will have its, India will be heavily affected by these conversations, so will Brazil, so will the other emerging economies and the developing world in general. So the question is, do you allow these conversations to happen among the big players, and then you join in? By then you're lost.
Sure.
By then you are already behind. It's going to be an uphill battle to even things out. So how do you begin this conversation? And I think it would only begin if there is trust among those players. So it's not only about vocally disagreeing, it's about offering solutions as well.
Sure.
And that is not something that is easy to do. Often people confuse defending your interests with being constructive. And that is the challenge, I think, that developing countries have, that India has, is how to present itself as part of the solution, right? And not just criticizing everything and shutting things down.
Sure. Robert, let's take the point forward. We are talking about disruption and the challenges in navigating international trade, global trade. There was a very distinctive point you were telling me offline, which will play a big role, and I want you to, elaborate a bit more. Demographic changes and AI. How's that disrupting the models of international trade, which have worked so far for decades, but probably may lose some of its relevance in the coming years?
Sure. Well, that's a very good challenge. Let me start by describing, at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, we have a group called the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. Michael Spence, who was in the previous panel, and Joseph Stiglitz are the co-chairs. It's 23 people from around the world, very sophisticated people. And what they did over about 3 years of exploration together is define what they call the disruptions and therefore the basis for the solution. My father was a doctor. Diagnose the disease before you prescribe the remedy.
Predictive.
And what they came up with, and I'll come back to your question because it relates to technology as a disruption of the structure of production and the structure of society, climate, as you put forward, and particularly in climate, we now have things that are produced anywhere that affect everywhere.
Yep.
And so a nation has to think globally to protect all of the humans that are affected by what happens from their carbon burning within their country. Third is finance. We have a very, how would I say, under-regulated or supervised global financial system where shocks propagate all around the world. When Janet Yellen was the Federal Reserve Chairman, she's a friend of mine, I had talks with her. Before the Federal Reserve started to raise interest rates, she went to China because so many people had taken in money in dollars, converted it to renminbi. When she started to raise rates, the dollar would rise. Everybody would liquidate their loans and create a deflationary shock in China. So your monetary zone is not just your nation. And then finally, the key one was the Treaty of Westphalia. The notion, the design, the vision of a nation state had disintegrated. And what happened there was also affected by what they called the induced disruption, which is when your society is failing, your politicians have to try to survive, so they don't cooperate globally so well. When your situation is failing, outward migration can become very profound. At this juncture, the scope and scale of African population growth, according to the International Office of Migration, is enormous. Now, what people talk about, Mike Spence is a real expert on this, is what creates what you might call export-led growth. You put on tariffs, you have low wages, you do manufacturing. With the new technologies, the AI-like and the machine learning and robots and so forth, it's not clear that having low-wage, so-called unskilled labor is going to be the magnet to start a development. You have an equatorial region in Africa. Subsistence farming is in danger. What if you don't have food, you don't have subsistence farming, and you don't have any new sectors for export-led growth? The scope and scale of outward migration in a continent that they are talking about being 1.8 billion people by 2080, according to the World International Office of Migration, is going to affect the entire world. Look at the anxiety in Europe now about African and Middle East migration that we've been through in the last 10 years. That's negligible compared to the challenge that Africa might present. So at this juncture, we have one other dimension, which is in the more developed countries. We have a tremendous amount of anxiety. Now, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and everybody said America divorced Detroit.
It was the hub of automobile
It was the hub of the automotive
and
industry.
exports for a very long time.
Yes, and it got smashed. Donald Trump, in his national aggression and anti-China, is a symptom of, that's how he marketed himself to the American people who felt they were suffering. I saw data recently in the United States comparing today to 1985. Almost 80% of Americans are worse off. Even though productivity's way up, the nature of the transformation associated with globalization and technology left a vast majority going down. and the distrust in expertise and the distrust in governance, according to the Gallup polls or the people who do the work for the World Economic Forum, it's just collapsed. I mean, the Center for Disease Control or the Federal Reserve, in light, when you have a particular shock like a pandemic or a financial crisis, you understand, but nothing's recovering. And so we have a situation, even in the developed countries, of despair.
Right.
Which brings me to India. I read a book, a gentleman who was born in India, lives in Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani, called Asia's 21st Century. I read this a couple years ago. And he said, the chapter's title was Why India May Be the World's Best Bet for Moral Leadership.
Very interesting.
And he talked about the body of work called the Mahabharata,
Yes.
of which the Bhagavad Gita is a core chapter. But he said, India understands in its core philosophy what working for we rather than me means.
Yes.
Working collectively. If we are going to deploy all of the potential and the exciting things in the medical realm and in production of robots, automation, machine learning, AI, we have to develop trust among people. I met with the Vice President of China in 2019 when Donald Trump was president, and he said, Robert, I'm very concerned because while I like Microsoft and I like Apple and I like Google, I'm afraid they're windows to spying on America.
Sure.
And I said, okay. And he said, but the other thing is, China's a big country and we can't stabilize things in America. The American government has to create transformational assistance, and instead Donald Trump is trying to make them hate us.
Yes.
Funny thing was when Huawei came back to America,
Yes.
I saw the Americans say, well, that's now a Chinese window to spy on America. We can't let that in here.
Yes.
So
Areas of
we need the vision of the Indian philosophy to create the trust now that the nation state is gone in order to build things together.
How cool. Wonderful. That's something interesting. Roberto, I'll let you have the last word because taking a leaf out of Robert's answer, how do you see the Indian model of international trade develop in this disruptive world? Some of the steps policymakers here in India are aiming at. The environment also inducing things on us that we are appearing and becoming like the choice of a favorable trade partner because of whatever's happened in the world. What is the answer and the direction India should take?
Well, I'm very concerned with the fact that governments are being less and less able to compromise. And I think what Robert was saying just a moment ago, the polarization that you see in society today, you are in a digital environment where you don't have time to explain your position. You're either for or against. It's a like or not like, and that's it. There is no space for arguments, and governments begin to behave the same way. I remember when I was a kid and people would say, well, when you become the government, when you are a government, when you are elected and of course a politician, you are supposed to take care of everyone. You have to be an arbitrator at the end of the day, right? That doesn't happen anymore. I mean, governments are taking sides. They're often ruling for one half of their population. Yes. And the other half, wait for your next cycle, right? So, and that reflects in foreign policy as well. And in international relations, the trick is to find the room for compromise. You never get what you want in an international negotiation, but the other side never gets what they want either. It's about finding common ground at the end of the day. But we're getting to a point where governments are sitting at the table with no room for compromise. Because whatever they do, they lose points at home. And that is the end of diplomacy at the end of the day. So this is an extremely impactful development of the polarization that we see domestically, is that the center is disappearing in international politics. So the challenge, I think, answering your question, is how do we maintain that space for compromise, and that's something that starts at home.
Great answer. In fact, gentlemen, we are completely out of time, but I think Robert's answer that what India teaches from the Bhagavad Gita or the Mahabharata is the collective approach, the approach of we. And our Prime Minister Modi also has often, quotes Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family, so we have to think in that direction, not just my home, my house, or my country. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us.
Let me just add one thing. I talked about exporting India's moral philosophy.
Yeah.
But I also think the way in which your country has deployed digital innovation is something that Africa could use. And I've spent a lot of time in Africa these last few years, and what they always say is the Chinese are building harbors and they're building highways and they want to take things out.
Minerals.
America's building forts. I believe India could go in and build the infrastructure to help these places develop and avoid the outward human migration that many fear.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, gentlemen, joining us this evening. Guys, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Azvedo, and thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you, Ajay, for that fantastic, in-depth panel looking at international commerce, which is such an important topic, and I mean, a perfect fit here at the Times Group Presents ET Now Global Business Summit.